Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. You're welcome to today's episode of Public Health in Real Life series. March is considered Women's History Month, and March 8th, to be specific, is International Women's Day. So, in this month of March, we're going to be interviewing a couple of outstanding women who are working on the front lines in healthcare, in social work, in gender equity, in business, and in all other fields that you can imagine. Today, we would have the pleasure of speaking with Anne Murray, and we're just looking forward to having a phenomenal time with her. Over to you, Ashwin.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to our viewers all over the globe. Good evening. We have the distinguished pleasure again of speaking to Anne Firth Murray today. So, my name is Ashwin Kadambi. I'm a senior global public health professional and your co-host today. The Public Health and Real Life series is aimed at educating people with sound public health information, celebrating heroes, and also inspiring the next generation of global health and public health students, professionals, and leaders. So, this weekend we have a special episode, a special interview to celebrate the International Women's Day, which is on March 8th, which is celebrated every year on March 8th. So, International Women's Day is a global day celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. The day also marks a call for action for accelerating gender parity. It provides a useful opportunity to reinforce the fact that everyone has a role to play in forging a more gender balanced world. With that, I welcome you from my side. Over to you, Maimuna, to introduce our distinguished guest today.
Thank you so much, Ashwin, on that expose on the background of International Women's Day. So, who is Anne Firth Murray, you might ask? Anne is a New Zealander who was educated at the University of California and New York University in economics and political science, with a focus on international health policy and women's reproductive health. Anne has worked as a writer and editor, and she taught in Hong Kong, Singapore, and more recently worked in the philanthropic world. She's the founding president of the Global Fund for Women, which provides funds internationally to support groups committed to women's well-being. Since 2001, Anne has taught on international women's health and women's rights at Stanford University. Ms. Murray has served on several boards and councils of nonprofit organizations, and she's the recipient of awards and honor for her work on women's health. In 2005, she was nominated as one of the group of 1,000 women for the Nobel Peace Prize. Her book on the early years of the Global Fund for Women, Paradigm Found, Leading and Managing for Positive Change, was published in 2006. The second edition of her most recent book on international women's health, From Outrage to Courage, The Unjust and Unhealthy Situation of Women in Poorer Countries and What They Are Doing About It, was published in 2013. Anne, welcome to today's show.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
So, Anne, if you could you just give a brief overview of your journey into international women's health and women's rights in general?
Well, this is, I've had a long life, and so it's a little difficult to say it briefly, but I'll try. I think my interest in women's issues began very, very early. When I was little, my brother had a paper route. He delivered papers around the neighborhood. And I asked my mother, I said, I'd like to have a paper route because he was making a little money out of it. And she said, well, you can't, you're a girl. And I thought, that's unfair. Why can't a girl deliver papers? So that was an early thing. Something else that led me into women's issues and working in this field was when I was working for a very fine organization. And there was a person in the Bay Area who was doing analysis of salaries of people working in this area. And he called me and he said, why do you put up with being paid 20% less than the men on the staff of your organization. And I said, I didn't realize that I was being paid unfairly. And so I went to the president of the organization and I told him that I had learned this. And his first question was, where did you learn this? And I told him that somebody was doing a study. And then he said, you're being paid very well for a woman. Now, that was a long time ago, and I was being paid very well for a woman. I had a good salary. It just happened to be 20% less than men's, and it seemed unfair. So this question of fairness has stuck with me. And from that time, when I was working for that organization, I began to be very interested in women's issues. And I was working in the philanthropic area. And I realized that the only foundation in the United States, anyway, that was focusing at all on women was the Ford Foundation, that was looking at women's policy issues at the time. And I thought there's a need for a women's organization that raises money and gives away money to the many women's organizations that I had met in my travels. And so I co-founded with a couple of friends the Global Fund for Women. And that was the beginning of the Global Fund for Women, and very much the beginning of my central focus on women's issues around the world. And it went on from there because I ran the Global Fund for 10 years. It continues to be a very good and effective organization over these many years. It's about 30 years old now. And then I went on to teach at Stanford. And so that's sort of a history of my interest in this field.
And very rich history it is, Anne. So in terms of like Global Fund, women's health and women's issues, what would you say are the critical issues that are facing international women's health on a global scale today?
The class that I taught at Stanford for many years and have just, I think, completed that and put it online. The name of that class all through the years that I taught at Stanford was Critical Issues in International Women's Health. And those issues, what I meant by critical issues was those issues that really mean life or death for women, depending on whether or not they can exercise their human rights. And human rights, of course, are just a wonderful concept. It's a dream, it's an ideal to have human rights. They're not, they are embodied in the laws of various countries, but international human rights, there's nothing that will enforce them, but they are an ideal. So we'll go back to that class that I was teaching and that later is kind of embodied in my book. The issues that I felt were critical for women, and they begin in childbirth, and I looked at it as a sort of through the span of life. Son preference, girls, babies, fetuses being killed because they're female. From the very beginning of life in some countries, women are not wanted, are discriminated against terribly. Child labor, both boys and girls suffer being pulled into the labor force at very young ages. HIV/AIDS, adolescent girls are the fastest growing group or the largest group contracting HIV and AIDS around the world. At least that was true 5 or 10 years ago. I think it's still true. I haven't looked at the latest studies on that, but that was true when I wrote the book anyway. And we go on. Early marriage, early childbirth, very dangerous for young women who are young girls, you might say, who are married early, forced marriage, and early childbirth. Violence against women, a critical issue, not unique. It's extremely common around the world. 1 in 3 women suffer violence at the hands of a community or an intimate partner in their lifetimes. 1 in 3. That number is well documented in places like Great Britain and certainly the United States, Mexico, and South Africa. They all share that statistic, 1 in 3. Japan's a little bit lower, Mexico's a little bit higher, South Africa a little bit higher, but 1 in 3 is the average around the world of women that will experience violence against women. I consider it the central issue, really, if we're talking about women's health and human rights. Violence or abuse, you might say, is the strategy that people use to increase their power or move up in a hierarchy. Countries use it by going to war. But war in the household really expresses a person's desire to be in control or to move up in a hierarchy. It's a terribly important issue. We go on through the life cycle to other issues, trafficking in women, economic issues. Women in many countries, including the United States, are still paid 15, 20% less than men for the same work. So those economic issues also have health consequences. And aging. Women live longer than men, interestingly enough. Men tend to die earlier, to some extent through violence. But women live longer, but they live in a less healthy way as they go through their lives. And very little attention has been given to older women, and for that matter, older men, aging. I think it's now becoming a topic that we read more and more about because the 20 people that were 25 and 30-year-olds growing up in the decades that precede us now are getting into their older years, and many more people are now talking and studying aging among men and women. Now, one issue that I haven't mentioned that I consider very important, but I did not really look at in any detail in my courses or in my book, and that is the issue of mental health, which is an incredibly important issue, both for men and women. But women suffer mental health greatly, partly because of all of these difficult issues that they've experienced in their lives. And we know very little about this internationally. Studies have not been done widely in the area of mental health, which is the reason that I didn't actually focus on it in my book. I didn't have cases, and I couldn't point to examples that would really explain what we know is a very widespread problem. So.
Well, that's really remarkable. And just hearing all the, the issues that you said that women face, and just that notion of power and people trying to retain and hold power and then demonstrate power over. You've had a rich life. You are in your 80s, though you don't look like it. So you'd have to tell us what that fountain of youth is. And you've seen a lot. You've experienced a lot. The theme for International Women's Day today by the UN Women is Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World. How do you, first of all, give us like a history of what women in leadership has been for the past, I would say maybe 20, 30 decades, and what we need to do to achieve that equality that the UN is asking for?
Yeah, let me first say that something harking back to what we just spoken about a few, in the previous few minutes. Not every woman in the world experiences these things. I mean, these horrendous things that I rolled out of my mouth, talking about what can happen to women. And in some countries, of course, much worse than in other countries. But we mustn't think that these generalizations apply to all women. Unfortunately, they apply to many women, and particularly the issue of violence. That was the one that I highlighted. But I did want to make that point that women certainly have made progress over the years. Women have been leaders over the years, and we find even in ancient societies reports of women that were queens and led their countries and that sort of thing. But I think we're seeing much more of that now. Women leaders emerging all over the world. I saw a very interesting um, um, little video thing on television the other day, which listed, maybe you've seen it. If not, I'll try to send it to you at some point, which just listed the women that are the head of their governments now around the world. And it was really impressive. I mean, I think really impressive. We have 180 countries, and there were 24 women highlighted in that document. 24 out of 180 doesn't sound very good, but these were the heads of governments in 24 countries. And even I, who've really looked in this field quite lengthily, had not realized how many women have emerged in leadership. I don't want to get too distracted, but as a New Zealander, I think probably you've all heard of Jacinda Ardern, who's the Prime Minister of New Zealand, a young woman. She's still, I think, in her late 30s now. And she became Prime Minister of New Zealand. And she is an inspiration for people and for young women as they move into leadership positions in New Zealand and worldwide. And there are others, of course, around the world. The question that often comes up when we talk about women's leadership, is it different from men's? Well, not necessarily. We look and see, does it make that much of a difference? I think women moving into leadership positions, it does make a difference simply because they are there and seen by children as they grow up, and children and other young people who see them as leaders and therefore think, oh, maybe I can do that. Maybe I can lead. Maybe I should go and get a university degree and move on and do whatever I need to do to become a leader. So I think that those women leaders are very important in terms of just the image that comes out. The question, though, is, do they lead differently? And it's not at all clear about, people have studied that. Are they different? I think that we can look at some particular examples where it's perfectly clear that they are different. And they are different in the sense of collaboration, not being afraid to ask for help from other people to be better leaders. There are these kinds of differences that some women may express, but not all necessarily. I'm not sure I responded to your question particularly. If not, do pursue whatever you want to get at.
No, you have responded perfectly. And I think just adding to that piece is, what would be your recommendation to ensure that women get into leadership positions? Because today in healthcare, I'll use healthcare sector, for instance, women make up more than 70% of healthcare workforce, but they only occupy 25% of leadership positions. So what
Yeah.
are strategies that governments, institutions, and individuals can deploy to ensure that women get into leadership positions and we can benefit for women in leadership?
Yeah, I mean, we're assuming, you're assuming that question that it's a good thing that women get into leadership, but we have to ask why. I mean, do they in fact lead in different ways that are very, very positive from the point of view of health? And I happen to think they do. But we have to really convince ourselves or learn more about it to believe that, if we really want to promote women moving into leadership positions. I am associated right now with an organization, a large organization, that has a group of nurses working in that place. And there are about 5 or 6 nurses. And then there's a head nurse. And the head nurse is a man. And every time I run across this in this organization, I think I don't like that. The organization is an organization, in fact, that caters more to women because it has to do with aging, people aging. And there are more women than men. And here are these nurses having this leader who's a man. Now, he's okay and he's qualified, but it just doesn't strike me as right that he should be the leader. So there's an example. In fact, now why, and I even thought to ask myself, why? Why not? Well, because we really need women's experiences and perspectives on the world in our leaders. We need it more and more. I think, especially when we're dealing with older women, but women in general, we need those perspectives to be brought into our programs and our work, the way we run our businesses. And I hesitate to generalize, even though I've been generalizing wildly. The way women lead, that is collaboratively, I think is better than the way some men lead, which puts them sort of, I here, do what I'm saying, follow what I say, I'm the leader, I'm the right person, I know everything. That's not as great leadership, I feel, as a more collaborative approach, where women and men, there are some very good leaders who are men, will seek different perspectives, team up, create groups to work on issues, rather than simply state how things should be. So again, I don't know if I'm answering your question well enough, but I think it's not so much that we need women leaders, but I think we need leaders who may be women, and maybe primarily women, who lead in different ways.
That's a great contextualizing it, that it's not just saying we want women leadership. It's we just want leaders that represents the needs of the population and who will do good work. And just to, before I hand this over to Ashwin, I just wanted to add, maybe I'm just biased because I'm a woman. In the whole COVID-19 response, they listed the countries that just were able to combat the virus, institute measures, and they turned out to be the countries that had women in leadership positions, New Zealand being one of them. So yeah, I think psychologists and everyone, behavioral scientists, are definitely studying the benefits of one gender versus the other in leadership positions. But I think that is just one of those success stories that we can highlight.
Absolutely, I think I mean that was amazing. I read about that, of course, and just to see the connection. Mm-hmm. And there has to be a connection between the fact that these countries that have done so well in persuading their populations, because that's what they had to do, to stop or reduce the effects of COVID. It was really amazing. Now, in addition, we might say most of those countries, not all, Germany was an exception, I think, were quite small countries and fairly homogeneous countries. So there may be other things, but why were women elected the heads of those countries? It's interesting to me to think about why why COVID was able to be contained so successfully in those countries led by women. It has to have to do with it. I believe there has to be a connection.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Anne. To our viewers who are just joining us, we have the distinct privilege of having a conversation with Anne Firth Murray today on critical issues in international women's health. And Anne, could you, I think you touched a little bit on this earlier, but could you discuss a bit about how that one night late discussion with 3 women in Nigeria had a profound impact in what you have accomplished in your life? Could you discuss a little bit about that?
Yeah, you mentioned, I just want to remember what I think we've got our countries wrong, because I don't know where did I write that in the book, and was it Nigeria?
Yeah, it was in a previous interview we saw that. Maybe it's a different country. It's fine.
I thought it was in Zimbabwe, but anyway.
Zimbabwe? Okay, cool.
it doesn't matter. But anyway, I can generalize that this was a meeting. I traveled with in a previous job in the philanthropic world. I traveled fairly widely because I was running programs having to do with international population and family planning programs and environmental issues, and so I had the privilege of traveling widely and meeting people all over the place, and that was when I first really went to Africa, and I went to East Africa primarily, Zimbabwe and Kenya and South Africa, and then I did in fact visit Nigeria, and I met women's groups in these places, and I remember some of these conversations. The conversation that I must have written about, or wherever you got that sort of little anecdote, I'm reminded of several conversations with women there who were running organizations in their villages or towns and really doing amazing work. And these were women who were, you might say, just village women. They were people who grew up necessarily without education. Some of them had education, some of them had primary education, a few had high school education. But many of the women that I met through those travels, and in Africa in particular, were just amazingly strong. African women we have an African woman with us here, amazingly strong people, against all odds, moving forward, helping their friends and villagers, looking after children, creating organizations, creating not exactly campaigns, but creating advocacy groups. I think the main thing that I came out of that meeting that you suggest was an anecdote at some point, was just this overwhelming strength. And I remember asking women every now and then, I'd ask them, how were you able to do this? How were you able to create this organization? How were you able to accomplish what you've accomplished? Because I was meeting people who were making differences in their towns and villages by creating health clinics, by doing all kinds of things, becoming nurses, making a difference to others. And again, they would answer a couple of different questions. That is, that their mothers had been strong, and they had observed that their mothers had come through in the face of poverty and all kinds of other difficulties. And they wanted almost to honor their mothers through doing this work. That was one answer. And another was their faith. I'm not a religious person at all. I'm not formally religious at all. But I must say I was impressed by the number of people who responded by saying that their faith allowed them to have faith that they could make a difference in the world. So that's my comment about that whole scene of learning from people, learning from people who are very different from us.
Sure. And it's quite incredible that Global Fund for Women allows women locally to decide how they would go about their grassroots initiative rather than imposing women's development agenda on them and trying to figure out what they need to do to achieve a particular deliverable. So in that, just curious is that majority of people, when they go to even if they go to Africa and they have a conversations like this, then they would go to another safari, then they will have some pizza locally, they will dance with the local groups, then they will come back. And they really don't, majority of us are convinced that we cannot make a difference in this world. And how did you come out of that and convinced yourself that you can have an effect? You can make a dent in this world if you have the will.
Well, if we're talking about how did I convince myself that the Global Fund for Women could work, could happen, is that really what it is? There was no organization supporting. I was working in the philanthropic world. There's a lot of money around, and there was no organization that at the time, except Ford Foundation, that was looking at policy. But I couldn't find an organization that was working internationally that supported women on the ground, that learned and gave away, that learned from women and gave away. I became a fanatic. Anyone who knew me then can tell you that. I just was determined to have this happen. But the whole idea was to learn, really. I mean, we didn't go into these countries thinking that we could tell them what to do. Oh, here's how to here's how to run an organization, or here's how to make a change. It wasn't like that at all. I mean, we waited, and to our absolute, and in fact, we thought at first maybe we couldn't raise the money. Maybe that was going to be a problem. Could we raise hundreds of thousands of dollars and then later millions of dollars to give away? Could we do that? Well, we found out, yeah, we could do that. But then we thought, were there people out there? Were there organizations that we could give this money to that would make a difference? And to our absolute amazement, I didn't know. We found that there were hundreds of organizations, probably thousands of organizations, in country after country, of women that were coming together in small groups making differences. Yes, they were relatively small groups, not big national entities necessarily, but village level, as I mentioned, town level, organizations that came together to make a difference. So we learned that there were women out there that were making a difference. Now, we thought that we would work in general in the field of human rights. And we knew sort of what we meant by that. But as we proceeded, we defined our programs in terms of what the women wrote to us about. We hope to say to them, look, we're here, we live in California, we have the capacity to raise some money. What should we do? Tell us what we should do. We want to be helpful to women.
Yeah.
And women wrote to us and began to define the issues. We asked them, tell us what it is you're trying to do. What is the problem you're trying to solve? And why are you trying to solve it this way? And let us know how we can help you. That was the way we went about our business, actually learning all the time from what women themselves considered the critical issues for them. And I remember in the 1990s, soon after the Global Fund for was created, we created it in 1987. In the 1990s, the Global Fund for Women could have become something called the Global Fund for Trying to Prevent Violence Against Women, because we had the most overwhelming number of requests from women's groups everywhere saying, we've got to do something about this issue of violence. And that's why I came away with this concept that it's probably at the center of women's health and human rights. But then they wrote to us about other things as well. Lawyers trying to get together across Africa, creating a network of lawyers, and other people doing all kinds of things. Of course, women trying to train others to work in the economic field, trying to create jobs so that women could make money and have their own money and their own ability to feed their children. But in general, we worked, I think, at the issues that one would consider human rights, which can be almost anything, really. Feeding your children might be considered a human right.
Sure. That's quite inspiring, and it's really inspiring for any growing professional or a leader. It's quite an important leadership quality to listen, and you have
Yeah.
just embodied that as a person, and that has just manifested in the in what Global Fund for Women does today. And so I looked at the Oxford Dictionary's definition for manliness, and it says to show courage and bravery. That is called manliness. And
Yeah.
when I looked at womanliness or women, it says showing the characteristics of gentleness, sensitivity, kindness, and all that. But today's problems, or the problems in the world that still exist, require, I believe, um, an attitude of courage, from outrage to courage, of course, an attitude of courage and bravery for women to succeed. Of course, studies show that women are much more successful leaders. However, these definitions are like limiting those. And already, there are also studies that show that women think of themselves as not maybe not as confident of themselves. So,
Yeah.
do you think that dictionaries need to really? It's time that they need to change how they even define women.
How we might change the definition of how we define women, did you say?
Yeah. I mean, like, so not just limiting the definition of womanliness to just gentleness and sensitivity, and really not limiting that, limiting what to be a woman means. It's more than that, right?
Well, of course, but I think it's really interesting that you read those definitions, because as you read the definitions from the Oxford Dictionary, I just thought we need to combine. We need to marry them. I mean, you know, we they're men should be allowed to be gentle and kind and sweet and wonderful, and women have and need to try to develop their bravery and their courage. Um, but I think more and more, I think we are in fact combining those in women, and I hope in men. I mean, I'm hoping that the work we do, working to encourage women, empower women, people use that term, and I can try to define that. We work to try to empower women, yes, but what about men? I mean, can we empower men to be gentle and sweet and kind? And of course, I know a whole lot of men that are lovely and sweet and nice and gentle, and maybe brave and courageous as well. So I feel a little bit that I'm not exactly answering your question, but I think just through example and through success stories, we can see people who lead differently. That I think back. I'm trying to think of the name. Oh, Havel, the leader of Czechoslovakia. He was a poet, and he was the prime minister, the president. It's certainly possible to not only become someone like that, but find them, observe them, and see how did these people do it. So I don't. Again, I'm not sure I'm following or responding as you wish, but.
No, I think just adding to like Ashwin's question, which you've really, really answered well, is even society creating labels on gender and trying to put gender roles and definitions in a box doesn't necessarily lend itself to allowing us get or explore all the benefits that each gender has to offer. Of course, today we're talking about women. It's those things limit women. I know of, and I've come from a long line of very strong women who, because they had to make certain decisions, were thought of as bold, courageous, in your face, arrogant, loud. And they're like, why are you behaving like a man? It's like, no, how do we define leadership characteristics and traits? And then people fit into those roles. Again, you don't have to, again, it's not about people fitting into a box, but it's how do you, like, what characteristics and traits do you need to perform as a good leader, whether you're a man or a woman? So you've definitely answered the question, and you've really touched on it. We have a few audience questions that I want to take, and then Ashton, I'll hand it over to you to go through the other questions. An audience of us asked, what does International Women's Day mean to you, Anne, especially when you look at it from like a public health or global health perspective?
I mean, what it means is that a whole lot of people call me and ask me to give interviews and talk about women's issues, and I think that's great to highlight it. I think it began early. I don't really know the history. I read about the history of International Women's Day, but it was important. It is important to highlight, not just on one day, but it is important to highlight the accomplishments of women and I think the needs of women, because we can't get around the fact that women and men do lead very different lives in general. And there are issues, especially this issue of violence, that affects women greatly. And people should know that. So I think International Women's Day gives us an opportunity to remind people that women can be leaders, and they are lauded, and they are invited to speak, and that kind of thing. And women also need special care, but so do everybody. Everybody needs special care. We need to be nicer to each other in general in this world.
That's a great response, Anne. The same audience, apparently she's having an amazing time, asked another question, and it says, based on your experience, Anne, what advice would you give to women considering pursuing leadership positions in their various fields?
Okay, I probably have a little bit of advice because I have thought a bit about empowerment and how it happens. What is it? And how can you get to feeling powerful enough to do what it is you want to do? And my little definition of empowerment is, first of all, to have clarity of vision. What is your vision? What's your vision for change? It may be small. It could be learning to drive or something. I mean, or it could be creating an organization that is concerned about women, or it could be anything. People want to become a doctor, whatever. What is your vision? Your own vision for change. And then you have to, if you want to be empowered, I think you have to say, okay, I have a vision. This is what I want to do. And I want to do it within the next 10 years or the next month or whatever. And you have a plan and you develop what do I have to do to get to that vision? What do I have to train myself? Do I have to learn a language? What do I have to do to move toward that vision? That's the second part of empowerment. First, the vision, clarity. This is my advice, clarity. Second, thinking what you have to do to move toward that vision. And third bit of empowerment is taking the first steps toward the plan to have that vision, to realize that vision. So my advice is to people who may be moving into leadership positions to try to have clarity of what they truly want, what they want to do, how they want to change the world, or what they want to do for themselves, whatever. Have clarity, and then stop and think what it takes. What do I have to do? What do I have to learn? Whatever. And then just be brave enough to take the first steps on your plan to begin to move toward it. That's kind of my advice.
Thank you, Anne. That was. We are also glad that we addressed the definition of empowerment, because usually that's kind of there are lots of misconception about what defines women empowerment, and so I would like to shift the conversation a little bit and go back to when you talked about violence against women. And in a previous interview, I believe you said if violence against women is considered as a disease, then we are having a pandemic. So 1 in 3 women face women violence, and from an intimate partner or somebody whom she knows. And in some countries, that number is even larger.
Yeah.
And eradication is defined as, of any disease succeeds only when a country with the weakest health infrastructure um, and its control program succeeds, right? That's when you really achieve eradication. So in countries, we still have um, situations where women face verbal threats. Then there's beating, flogging, whipping, raping. All these problems still exists. So how can love act as a force for social justice?
Um, well, I have to think about that. That's a
No problem. Take your time. Take your time.
very, very difficult question. Um, I read just a little sentence the other day that really struck me about love. And it was simply this: love is the wise man's revenge, or love is the wise person's revenge. And I thought that's really interesting. The idea that you want to get back at somebody, you want to get back at that person who's hurting you. And is it true that we should obviously not fight violence with violence? Certainly not. That is useless. But can we come to a point where we can fight it, or I don't like the word fight, but respond to the violence in our lives with compassion, love, compassion, truth, all these good things, and somehow have those traits, those values become strong enough to actually do something in terms of violence. Now, I'm sure there are people maybe watching this thinking, oh, this woman is so naive. I mean, how ridiculous. That, how can you possibly say that? But we've got to come up with a better way of dealing with serious problems like violence than war. I mean, war is not good. So nations engage in violence back and forth. And people think that, and I remember when I was little, and I grew up in a very, very nice household, but nevertheless, if you were naughty, you could expect to have a spank on the bottom. Now, I think there are a lot of people who've argued very much against that. Why should we be punishing children with violence, teaching them that that is the way to solve a problem? And I think we have, in many countries and cultures and many places around the world, by spanking kids or punishing them with violence, we're teaching them that that is the way to deal with a problem. So how can we, you're asking me, I think, how can we turn that around and see if we can somehow respond? And people have done this at the national level in India, a number of countries, that is, respond with nonviolence. And I've used the word love as a force for social justice because I've been teaching this class on women's health and human rights, and violence has been very much at the center of it. And I decided quite a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, that I didn't want to be dragged down by thinking about violence. So I began to read about nonviolence. I remember saying to myself, let me not get dragged down by my discussions, by my teaching, by my writing a book about these terribly violent kinds of issues. And I thought, no, Anne, now don't let yourself get disheartened. Read about nonviolence. Read the opposite. So that's what I started to do. And that led me to reading Gandhi and, a number of other authors. And Gandhi in particular equated nonviolence with love. And I thought, oh, this is fascinating. I was really taken by the idea that love was nonviolence. Nonviolence was love. And that's what led me, in fact, to start teaching a class on love as a force for social justice. Because I, rather than use the term nonviolence, I thought, let me use the term love in my class, even though people said, you don't want to put that word in the name of your class. And I said, oh, yes, I do. Because I mean it as compassion, truth, caring, kindness, love. And I think it can be powerful. In fact, I know it can be powerful. And of course, we know that nonviolence can be powerful, because in a number of countries, people have used nonviolence. Martin Luther King, Gandhi used nonviolence as their, you might say, weapon. I wouldn't want to say that, but I don't like that word either.
Yeah.
But as the strategy that they used.
And that's such a powerful response. I am left speechless. I will let Maimuna go.
Yeah, Ashwin, I think I'm equally speechless. It's interesting you raised this whole dichotomy with trying to respond to why we have violence against women by moving us to the root cause. Is people are taught to be brash, to be bold in responding to being hurt. And I think that's what usually happens in like intimate partner violence, is the man feels threatened or disrespected. And then that's when that now becomes, it gets into the violence. It's interesting. You also mentioned how, studying nonviolence is actually the best response to violence. Now, Martin Luther King, who you mentioned earlier, is a huge proponent for peace. He's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. But he also said something where he talked about riot is the language of the unheard.
Yes.
How, from your perspective, what does that mean to you, and how does it play out in critical issues facing women today?
What did he? Violence is the language of.
A riot is the language of the unheard. This had to do with the racial riots and protests.
Oh, the riot is the language of
the unheard, or the voice of the unheard.
Oh, that's very interesting. The beauty of the work of Gandhi and I think Martin Luther King and others was that they eschewed riots. They had almost a riot of nonviolence. In other words, they moved to nonviolence rather than to a dangerous riot, to give voice to people who otherwise would have been voiceless. So, yeah, I don't know what more to say. I mean, yes, I think people who feel who feel disempowered. I mean, people who don't have the opportunity to have a vision for change, to feel that they can make a plan to change, to think that they can take the first steps toward that plan. They're not able to have that. They don't have it. They are unheard, as he said. I guess the voice of the unheard. So people would say, okay, how do we deal with that? And I think most people would say education. That's the first, absolutely the first intervention that everybody would say. These people need education. But what kind of education? What is the nature of the education that we're handing a lot of people? It's so important. The nature of the education is incredibly important. if we're really trying to offer the possibility of change for the unheard, these people who are living among us in every country, who feel unheard and often will, burst out with violence because they haven't had the opportunity to learn that they might have the possibility of using some other method to deal with their situations. And so education would, I think, be thought of as the first intervention. And I don't put down education. It's a very important intervention. But we need a kind of education or a kind of interchange or a kind of collaboration with people who are unheard and are wanting to change things in a violent way. We need to develop ways of making a difference to those people, being there for them, including them. We have to be much more proactive in this. It's not just empowering people. And incidentally, another definition of empowerment, which I like, is releasing the spirit within a person, that assuming that there's already something in that person that would allow them to take over and be empowered in their lives to do what they might want to do, to try to go toward their vision of peace or their vision of plenty or their vision. So how do we offer that kind of education that to such people, to include them, to honor them, to respect them, to have compassion? I'm kind of a Pollyanna. I'm somebody who I think if we try hard to be kind and compassionate in our own lives, and we can talk about it, and we can train children to be that way, that we can change the world. I still think that, despite how difficult things seem. And I think I don't know. I think of my mother because I think my mother had a big effect on. One of the questions you thought you might ask is who had an effect on you, or something like that. Who impressed you?
Yeah, exactly. So, who we really wanted to know, like that was incredible, by the way. So we wanted to know, like, is there a women leader that inspired
to know.
you?
Oh yes, asking about women leaders that impressed me.
That have inspired you?
Inspired me. Well, I will include my mother because in thinking about all of these things, I often think back of my mother. I grew up, and I was, in elementary school at the time of the Second World War, and the Germans were the enemy. And I remember coming home and saying to my mother, "I hate the Germans." And I was 8 or 9 or whatever I was. "I hate the Germans." And my mother, I never forgot it. My mother turned to me. She said, "Mustn't hate anyone." Just, that's what she said, among a number of other things that my mother said to me. And I learned a lot from her. But I remember that. And I thought, oh, okay, that's right. I mean, I took it in. Okay, who else has impressed me? My mother impressed me. Right now, we have some leaders. I will think of Jacinda Ardern, who's the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She's young. She's a woman. She just had a baby about 6 months ago or whenever. She stepped into the Prime Minister's job really surprisingly. I mean, she is young. She hadn't been in the party that long. But she has led New Zealand very effectively. Very effectively. She's very practical, down to earth, and she follows her conscience. She doesn't just follow the party. She follows her conscience and she articulates it, and she reaches out very, very effectively to draw people in, and she listens to other people. So I think she's a good leader. I think she's a very good leader. There are a couple of didn't I say before, I don't tend to sit at the feet of people. I don't tend to think of people as great heroes, even though I am impressed by heroic deeds by people. But I have kind of a difficulty with that question. I think many women leaders of these 23 or 24 countries that we can list are impressive because for the most part, they're very brave to take the steps they've taken. Almost all of those leaders have been through a tough row to become the heads of their countries. So that's impressive. Yeah.
Can't agree more. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of bravery, we actually have one more audience question that we want to take just before we wrap up. Findings have shown that less than 40% of women who experience violence seek help of any sort. So most people do not report violence, and maybe it's like you said, being bold enough and brave enough to step up. So why do you think that is, and what can we do to mitigate that?
I'm sorry, you said that 40% do not report violence, or
Yes.
what? I'm sorry, I missed.
Yes. So it's actually on the screen that, studies have just shown that less than 40%, yes, less than 40% of women who experience violence of any sorts seek help.
Yeah.
In that case,
why is it? Yeah.
Yes. Why?
I mean, there may have been studies asking them, and maybe somebody knows the answer to this question, but here's what I think might be the reason, or here are what the reasons. I think, one, they're afraid to. If they do it, it may bring on more violence. So there's fear to do that. Second, it's very, very difficult for somebody to report violence or something against someone that they love. They, this might be their husband or their lover. Someone they love has broken down and perpetrated violence. They don't want to do that. They're not willing to report that. Other problems in many places, until quite recently, even now, they're not believed. They simply, the authorities or whoever they might report this to won't believe them. This man is an upstanding leader in his country or in his village or wherever, and he would never do that to you, so no, you're lying, you're making it up. So that they're afraid that they won't be believed. So there are those, I think those are some of the reasons that we find.
Women, absolutely. Globally, women need that moral support, I believe, from the friends, family, and the support system to enable them to speak out. And there must be, people around her who is willing to speak out and step up. And
yes.
And I wanted to, for our last question, we wanted to ask, what is your vision for this planet?
I think you told me that you were going to ask me that question. Yes. I mean, I was thinking, what is the vision for the planet? Well, I'm just going to sort of repeat myself. I say, I wish we could all be very, very much nicer to each other. I'd like to see individual people actively expressing love and compassion and all of these good things. Respect. I'd like to see that taught more in the schools. I'd like to see it expressed more by our leaders. I'd like to see men feeling empowered enough to be gentle and sweet and talk about it and not feel that they're being too much like a woman or something and weak. And I'd like to see women express bravery and courage without being put down by it, by doing that. I yeah, I want the perfect family and the perfect world that way for everyone. But I do sound like a very naive person, I think. And I don't think I am.
No, those are words of wisdom, and thank you for that.
Yeah.
Emuna, over to you to wrap up.
Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you, Anne. It's funny you keep saying maybe you sound naive. Like I said earlier, you're in your 80s. You've lived life, you've experienced life. So for you to come full circle and preach kindness, preach love, it comes from a place of wisdom. And I hope, you get to see that that vision, like, Ashwin asks you, at least begin to see movement towards it as we all walk towards, healing, racial reconciliation, gender equity, health equity, and combating climate change and everything that plagues the world as we know it. We've had an absolute pleasure and in fantastic time with you. Our audience have just been given, comments and feedback, and we've seen. I think this is the most we've had live audience questions, Ashwin, since we started. This just shows how engaging it is. So, Anne, you teach this course at Stanford called Love as a Force for Social Good, and like you said, it's one of the only maybe two courses that is not just in that institution, but anywhere that even has the title Love in it. If any of our live audience or anyone watching this after the fact would want to reach out to you, how can they reach out to you? What are your social media handles?
Well, two things. Both my classes, the class on international women's health and human rights and the class on love as a force for social justice, are online on Coursera. So people can go and take a look at them online on this platform called Coursera, Coursea. Mm-hmm. And the International Women's Health and Human Rights class is also online on Stanford Online. So they can go to Coursera or they can go to Stanford Online to see the International Women's class. On the Love class, that's only on Coursera, but it's up. Anyway, that's when, and if they wanted to send me an email or something, if people want to be in touch, maybe they can email you and you can send it on to me or something. I don't exactly want to hand out my email. I'll be overwhelmed and then I'm sorry that I don't want to. I want to be able to answer people. Yes. So if you could give them some sort of email address, and then just feel free to send it on to me if there are any questions or thoughts, commentary. I welcome them.
Yeah. No,
but
definitely.
I don't want to be quite overwhelmed with it.
And we totally understand that. So for our live audience or anyone watching, if you have any questions or follow-up for Anne, please send us an email at publichealthinreallife@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook. We're on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with us and we would pass on the message to Anne. One more thing about our channel is we're on YouTube. So if you've enjoyed this content today, we have much more exciting content that will be coming up, and we have some past content. So please like our channel, subscribe, send us comments, questions, feedback on issues that you would like to see us discuss and what experts you would like us to bring up to interview. Once again, thank you so much, Anne, for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe, be well, and be kind to one another, like Anne recommended and advised.
That's good. Thank you.